evening. It's always a joy to assemble together on the Lord's Day once again to praise Him in song and approach His throne in prayer and open up the Bible and study from His Word. I'm going to ask you to open up your Bibles to Luke chapter 14. Luke chapter 14 is where we are going to spend pretty much all of our time together this evening. Some of you may know that we began several weeks ago now. Well, I can tell you, 14 weeks ago now, we began a weekly Bible study at McDonald's in Brownsburg on Tuesday mornings, and we've been going through a chapter of Luke each week as the guidelines for our discussion there during that study. And just this past week, we read and talked about Luke chapter 14 together. And so that chapter and everything contained within it has been on my mind a lot since then. And I was just so impressed by this text. Even though it's one that I've read many times, there was something about this text that really stood out to me that I wanted to share with you all this evening. When you read Luke as a whole, you'll very quickly realize that Luke is not very concerned with the order of things. Now, he is in the sense that Jesus is born at the beginning and he dies at the end, but everything in between, his idea of chronology is a little bit different than some of the other gospel writers. I'll give you a couple of examples. In chapter 14 and verse 1, which we're going to read here in just a moment ago, Luke's timestamp is like this: now it happened. In chapter 12 and verse 1, in the meantime. Chapter 11 and verse 1, now it came to pass. Those are Luke's timestamps. Now John, very different. John will say things like the next day, or on the third day, or then 6 days before Passover, these things occurred. You can see the difference with how they approach telling the story of Jesus. Well, what Luke is doing is, instead of grouping things chronologically, he is largely grouping things thematically. And he does that in chapter 14. Whether or not the things that we're going to read together this evening happened right in the same time frame or not, Luke sees a common thread in what occurred here that he wants us to see as well. And the word that stood out to me as I was reading through chapter 14 is value. Jesus, in a multitude of different occasions here in chapter 14, or a couple of different occasions, I guess that's not a multitude, in a couple of different occasions, Jesus takes the opportunity to talk to people about value. When he talked to the Pharisees, these were people who valued wealth. They valued prominence. They valued law. They valued tradition. Honestly, if you think about our culture today, things haven't changed very much. Our culture today largely values wealth and prominence and law and tradition. And in Luke chapter 14, Jesus is asking them, and he's asking you and I, to think about things a little differently. To consider the hierarchy of things in our mind. What is it that we truly value? What do we value over other things? Jesus is going to challenge us here to change our thinking as it pertains to the idea of value. And so there's going to be four things that we're going to look at briefly together this evening that Jesus is going to challenge largely the Pharisees and others that are in his presence here in Luke chapter 14. And he's going to challenge us today to consider these things as well. And the first is going to take place at the very beginning of this chapter. I'd like to read the first 6 verses with you together. Luke chapter 14, beginning in verse number 1. Now it happened, as he went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath, that they watched him closely. And behold, there was a certain man before him who had dropsy. And Jesus, answering, spoke to the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? But they kept silent. And he took him and healed him and let him go. Then he answered them, saying, which of you having a donkey or an ox that has fallen into a pit will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day? And they could not answer him regarding these things. Jesus does this. One of the other things we've noticed reading through Luke, he does this time and time again, intentionally it seems, where he is going to perform miracles on the Sabbath day to challenge the Pharisees in this way. And he does that here. As in the midst of these people on the Sabbath day, he sees a man with dropsy. And without the Pharisees even having to ask the question, he approaches them, is it lawful for me to heal on the Sabbath? He knows what their answer to that question is. They've run him out of towns already because of what their answer to that question is. But Jesus heals the man. And he makes the point to them, you guys would help an animal out of a pit on the Sabbath day, but you're going to tell me that you wouldn't help another person who is ailing? See, the Pharisees value the day over the person. Jesus values the person over the day. Maybe even to take it a step further, Jesus values the person over the law. In Matthew chapter 22, when Jesus is tested and asked about what the greatest of the commandments are, do you remember what he says? Beginning in verse number 37 of Matthew chapter 22, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and prophets. In Mark's account of this interaction, he tells basically the same story, but concludes it by saying, there is no command greater than these. Mark chapter 12, 28 through 31. Jesus wants to drive home the point that he values the person over the law. The well-being of the individual is more important than the Sabbath day. The day that God created, the day that God commanded these people to keep holy, the person is more important. So much so that Jesus, very famously as we just read, it's the greatest commandment that's given. You love God and you love people. And on those two things hang all the law. Now, obviously, in our culture today, as in their culture, as first century Christians, specifically as Jews, their adherence to the Sabbath was something that they held dear to them. The Pharisees especially had created a lot of customs and traditions around that. We don't necessarily relate to those customs and traditions in the same way as they did. However, the principle is just as true today as it was back then, and it should hit home with us just as hard as it did for them back then. As Christians, as followers of Jesus, we should value the person over everything except God himself. When you look around this room, he created every single one of us. When you go out to the grocery store, everybody you're around, he created every single one of them. He sent his son to die on the cross for every single one of them. He wants that person's soul in heaven with him forever. Every single one of them. And so if we have the opportunity to help someone who is in need, there is no excuse that should keep us from doing that. Because that's what Jesus would do. He would say, everything else can wait. You take care of that person. Because that's what's important. Now that doesn't mean, by Jesus saying this, that doesn't mean that the Sabbath day wasn't important. Not at all. But the point that he's making is value. And we are to value the person over the law. We are to value the person over the day. That's the value that Jesus sees in us. when you continue reading in Luke chapter 15, that point stands out even greater, perhaps, in the very next chapter, as the stories of the lost sheep and the lost coin and the lost son are told. And the unique nature of each individual is shown there, and the value that God places on each individual soul is seen in each of those stories. Jesus sees great value in the individual, and we should as well. Second thing that Jesus points out, beginning in verse number 7. So he told a parable to those who were invited, and when he noted how they chose the best places, saying to them, "When you are invited by anyone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in the best place, lest one more honorable than you be invited by him, and he who invited you and him to come and say to you, 'Give place to this man,' and then you begin with shame to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down in the lowest place, so that when he who invited you comes, he may say to you, 'Friend, go up higher.' Then you will have glory in the presence of those who sit at the table with you. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." You see what Jesus is placing value in as he tells this story? Jesus places value in humility. As he tells the story, it's almost a cringe-inducing story to think about going over to someone's house for dinner, and you just kind of casually walk in and you think, "Hey, they invited me over for dinner. I'm going to sit at the head of the table." And then they have to come and say, "Actually, I'm sorry, can you move down a little bit further? That's reserved for someone else." That would be very embarrassing, to think of yourself as worthy of sitting at the head of the table, only then to be asked to move. That would be nobody would like that situation or be comfortable in that situation. But Jesus says, instead of thinking yourself worthy of that position, value humility over prominence. Value meekness over prominence. And then allow someone else to promote you. Allow someone else to build you up. When I think about, again, the application of that today, I think about the importance of us as Christians being engaged in hospitality specifically. And I think sometimes we can fall into the trap, whether we're doing it consciously or unconsciously, fall into the trap of, I'm going to invite someone over to my house with the expectation that they're going to return that invitation and invite me over to their house. Well, I think the story that's being told here and the point that's being made is we can't look at it that way. That's putting ourselves up on a pedestal and saying, I'm going to do something nice for someone, but only if they do something nice for me in return. This equation needs to balance. And Jesus is saying, I don't want you to look at situations in that way. I want you to look at things from a place of humility. And so you serve someone else by inviting them into your home. Now, if they thank you or return that invitation in some manner, great. But that's not why you're doing it. You're doing it from a place of humility. You're doing it from a place of servitude. Valuing humility over prominence. Again, something that the Pharisees desperately struggled with during this time frame as they valued being seen over everything else. They wanted to be known as the most important person in the room. They wanted to be known as the one that you would come to with questions, and they had all of the answers. And Jesus says, I need you to change your way of thinking. I want you to value humility. He who humbles himself will be exalted. And continuing on in Luke chapter 14, we're going to begin this time in verse number 16. And then he said to him, a certain man gave a great supper and invited many, and sent his servant at supper time to say to those who were invited, come, for all things are now ready. But they all with one accord began to make excuses. And the first said to him, I've bought a piece of ground and I must go and see it. I ask you to have me excused. And another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm going to test them. I ask you to have me excused. And still another said, I've married a wife and therefore I cannot come. So that servant came and reported these things to his master. And the master of the house, being angry, said to his servant, Go out quickly into the streets and lanes of the city and bring in here the poor and the maimed and the lame and the blind. And the servant said, Master, it is done as you commanded, and there's still room. And the master said to the servant, Go out into the highways and the hedges and compel them to come in, that my house may be filled. For I say to you that none of those who are invited shall taste my supper. So there's an invitation that has been extended in this story. There's an invitation to a dinner, a feast, that has been extended in this story. And those who received the initial invitation, they didn't see the value in it. They saw value in taking care of their oxen. They saw value in taking care of their land. They saw value in attending to their spouse. They didn't see value in the invitation that was extended to them. And as such, they chose to do the activity or attend to the thing in which they saw the most value. Well, it's very clear the point that Jesus is making here, because he too has come and extended an invitation. He has extended an invitation to all of us. To the entire world, he has extended an invitation. And when you look around the world, there are a lot of people who just do not see value in that invitation. They do not see the value of what is being offered. And so, careers take precedent. Families take precedent. Activities take precedent. Your own desires and lusts, they take precedent. Why? Because those things, in the eyes of those who refuse this invitation, have more value than what's being offered to them by Jesus Christ. When I think about what Christ came to earth to bring to us, and the opportunity that he placed in front of every single one of us, it boggles my mind how anyone could see something as more valuable than that. But I think if we're honest with ourselves, we've all struggled with that at times. As the demands of a job, the demands of a family, the demands of school, the demands of activities of all kind, they seem really, really important. And many of those things are really, really important. But Jesus is encouraging us to realize that they aren't more important than the invitation that he is extending to you. The gospel invitation to come to him and to be a part of his family and to seek forgiveness through his sacrifice, that is an invitation that should have value beyond anything we can comprehend. And so the decisions that we make should reflect that. How we respond to this invitation will tell us everything about how much value we place in it. And then finally, the last one that I want us to consider this evening, beginning in verse number 25. Now great multitudes went with him, and he turned and said to them, If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it, lest, after he has laid the foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, This man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king, going to make war against another king, does not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? Or else, while the other is still a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks conditions of peace, so likewise, whoever of you does not forsake all that he has cannot be my disciple. Jesus is asking us to value following him over our very lives. Following him over family relationships. Following him over marital relationships. He is asking us to value following him more than anything. Who is all in? That's what Jesus wants to know. Who is willing to sacrifice everything to follow me? And the answer to that question is the person who sees that pursuit as valuable. If we don't see the pursuit of following Christ and being a disciple of his as valuable, then there is no way that we will place it above our very lives. We value our lives almost more than anything. We value the lives of our spouses and our children more than anything. We can't value it more than following Christ. And that may sound extreme in nature, and I think that's the point of this, is to sound extreme. Because that's how important our decision to follow Christ is. That's how valuable a life of following Jesus Christ is. And he's not asking us to follow him blindly. He's not asking us to follow him ignorantly. He's asking us to be fully aware of the cost of doing so. And upon making those calculations, coming to the determination that it's worth it. It is worth it to be all in following Christ. All of the hardships that may come our way as a result of that in this physical life, it's worth it. Because I value Christ and following him above the pain and the suffering that may come in some of those areas. But it's important to ask ourselves and to evaluate the decisions that we make to determine if we're living a life that reflects that. Does your life reflect the value that Jesus is asking you to place on following him? You know, it's one thing to tell others about our values. It's one thing to tell others about what is most important to us. But demonstrating what we value through our actions is what Jesus is paying attention to. And that's what he is challenging the Pharisees to do in Luke chapter 14. That's what he's challenging you and I to do today. To evaluate our actions, to evaluate our decisions, and take a step back and say, do I value the individual over the law? Do I value the person over the day the way that Jesus did? Do I value humility over prominence? Do I value the invitation of Christ that he has brought to this world over the physical responsibilities that I may have? Do I value following Christ even over my own life? I hope you would verbally answer all of those questions as yes. But I would challenge us to take an inventory of our decisions and our actions and to see if the answer to those questions is yes. Jesus is looking for followers who are all in. Jesus is looking for followers who understand what's most important. He's looking for followers who are willing to sacrifice on his behalf because we know just how valuable what he's offering truly is. So if you're here this evening and you're not a child of God's, do you value the invitation that Christ extends to you, enough to put to death the old person of sin, enough to leave behind the life of sinful behaviors, of lust and desires. If you have become a Christian, but you find yourself falling back into some of those old habits, it's an indication that you're not valuing what you had in Christ. And I would encourage you this evening to think about that, to think about what you're potentially giving up, and to realize that there is nothing that this world can offer you that is more valuable than the relationship that you can have with God. So if you're here this evening and you need to become a Christian, or if you need the help of the congregation to reestablish that relationship and to hold you accountable in those areas and to help you realize the value that can be seen in a relationship with God, we would love to help you. So whatever your spiritual needs may be, please come to the front and let us know as we stand and